Egypt was never part of the empire, you may say, and indeed formally you'd be right. Egypt was an emergency, an anomaly, an experiment, and for a while, a bit of a success. No sooner had British troops landed here than the British government announced they'd be leaving. In fact, they stayed for 70 years. What on earth were they doing here? The reason could be found just across the desert, the Suez Canal. This 120-mile slice through Egyptian territory was the lifeline of the empire, dramatically cutting sailing time to India. Most of the ships passing through it were British. They brought tea and cotton and jute from India and beyond to Britain. They could take troops back to quell another mutiny. Trouble near the canal might spell trouble for Britain. And trouble had been brewing in the streets of Cairo. Egyptians were angry about foreign influence in their country. When riots broke out in the city, the British grew nervous. The Cairo riots triggered a classic piece of imperial footwork. The pattern goes like this. British people or British interests are threatened, British forces are sent to protect them, and they never leave. In Egypt, they didn't leave because they hardly admitted they'd arrived. Much of the British occupation of Egypt was passed off as little more than a spot of armed tourism. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. For many years, Egypt was run quietly from this building, now the British Embassy. And this was the man who ran it, ruling Egypt for over 20 years and perfecting the strange machinery of British power in the Middle East, Sir Evelyn Baring. Officially, he was just consul general rather than colonial governor, but with 6,000 troops stationed next door, there was no doubt who was in charge. It wasn't just his size that gave him the nickname Overbearing. Baring was an imperialist through and through. He regarded the Egyptians, and indeed most foreigners, as children. And he treated them accordingly, with occasional concern and permanent disdain. It earned him their profound resentment. Baring allowed the Egyptian elite to imagine they were still running the country. The British are easy to deceive, said one Egyptian politician, but when you think you've deceived them, they give you the most tremendous kick in the backside. Baring was a man who liked to exercise power behind the throne. He did not give commands, but it was said, advice which had to be taken. Here, the workings of empire had become almost invisible. The British found a word for it. Egypt was not a colony, it was a protectorate. Bering allowed himself 2 hours each evening to exercise at the Gezira Sporting Club. As they did all over the empire, British officials in Cairo repaired to the club at the end of the working day. You can be so mean in croquet, can't you?
And it is in many countries now.
It is in many countries, yes.
حلوة عبلة.
Have you been a member here a very long time?
In the club, yes, about more than 50 years, 55 years.
55 years. Do you remember when the British were here?
Yes.
And what did you think?
I think they were forbidding any Egyptian to enter this club unless they take a license from the
Really?
British. Yes.
Were you glad to see the English go?
For sure.
We weren't all bad, were we?
Huh?
We weren't all bad.
All kinds of imperialism is bad.
But was there nothing good that the British did here?
يعني nothing was good.
All the time they were here, 70 years, and it was all...
70, more than 70 years.
Yes. Did they do nothing good?
I think no. Not. How many times did you come to Egypt?
Oh, I've been 3 or 4 times.
4 times.
Yes, I think.
You are most welcome here.
Well, it's very nice of you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Particularly in light of our history.
This is one of the good things which imperialism did. In
Hey, well, you found one thing.
You-
The temporary intervention in Egypt, the bit of empire that never was, would last into the middle of the 20th century. Bering himself, the Invisible Man, left in 1907 to retire to Bournemouth. Bering's last carriage journey from the British headquarters to the railway station was marked by what one witness called a chilly silence. I don't suppose he'd have cared that much. He wasn't here to be loved. But I wonder what he'd have made of the fact that even generations later, there were Egyptians traveling to England to spit on his grave. As the 20th century dawned, Britain's sense of its role in the world had given it dangerous delusions about what it could do. World War and its aftermath would expose these delusions in a merciless fashion. The First World War stretched far beyond the mud and trenches of Northern Europe. It reached into the streets and deserts of Palestine and the Middle East. Once again, Britain feared for its key strategic asset, its lifeline to India, the Suez Canal. It had to be protected. The region was ruled by Britain's war enemy, Turkey. In their desert conflict with the Turks, the British needed allies. The Bedouin tribes of the Arabian desert knew this arid land, and they knew how to survive in it. If they could be encouraged to rise up against the Turks, they might prove invaluable. But who could unite them? This is the edge of the Sinai Desert. It was here that a young man came on a secret mapping mission for the British Army. It was disguised as an archaeology field trip, and it was the beginning of a long love affair with the desert and with the Arab people. That love affair created one of the most romantic figures in the history of the British Empire, Thomas Edward Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence, the illegitimate son of an Irish baronet, scholar, archaeologist, linguist, was just the man to charm and inspire the Arabs into a desert revolt. The story of an Englishman leading an exotic army across the desert caught the public's imagination. In contrast to the mud and murder of the Western Front, here was a sweeping campaign fought in blazing sunlight. And here too was a different kind of imperialist. Romantic, idealistic, dashing, and slightly nuts. Lawrence had a passion for the Arabs and their way of life. His ability to live like them impressed them. So did the gold from the British treasury he brought to pay them.
Shukran.
And he gave them something more, a belief in themselves as an Arab nation. As his masters in London had hoped, he coaxed them into fighting with the British with the promise of their freedom once the war was over.
הוא נראה כמו שייך של השייכים, ככה, עם הלבוש הבדואי.
Do you think he was a good man?
Yeah.
Why?
איך אומרים? איך אומרים? גבר. לא חשוב מה הכוונה.
He was a real man,
הוא גבר, לא משנה מה התפקיד שלו, הוא אחד כזה שחשוב. אז אחד כזה אתה נמשך אליו, אתה קורא עליו, אתה רוצה לדעת מי זה האיש הזה.
Do you think that the promises that he made were ever kept?
שום דבר באזור פה לא, שום הבטחה לא התקיימה. פה באזור.
Lawrence promised his Arab fighters freedom from foreign rule. They believed Palestine would be theirs. There would be many more promises made, and just as many broken. The war in the desert finally brought Britain a string of heady victories. Imperial troops from India, Australia and New Zealand, as well as Britain, swept across the region. By the winter of 1917, the ultimate prize was within their grasp.